Hello and welcome to What's on Your Shelf. I'm your host Mulure Mike, and today I am at a very special place. I'm seated with a gentleman who's seen history through his own eyes. And having served the country in various capacities through various administration, we have the privilege and the honor to sit with a man whose name is synonymous with justice. If you think about the works that he has done, nothing comes close to a history and a lifetime full of so much hard work. And that's why we are here today. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are seated with Mr. Sharad Rao EBS.
Tribunal will be chaired by renowned legal practitioner Sharad Rao.
However well-meaning and however transparent, will not be perceived by the public as independent. I had to leave school after senior Cambridge because we did not have the financial means for me even to go up to advanced level. When Jonjo resigned and Karugu became the Attorney General, so at that time Mboya appointed me as the DPP.
Yeah.
How can I describe myself? Well, I was born in Kenya. I went to school in Kenya, which was the only, the schools in those days were divided racially. So the school for Indians was what is now known as the Jamhuri School, which used to be the government Indian high school at one time, and then became the Duke of Gloucester School. So that's where I did my senior Cambridge, right? Now, I didn't proceed beyond Cambridge. Senior Cambridge is the equivalent of O-level. But because of financial constraints, I was not able to go further. So I left school in 1953, having just passed my senior Cambridge examination. And I took up a job with the Kenya Shell. So I worked for Kenya Shell from 1953 to about 1956. And in 1956, my boss, a European, he said to me, look, I think you are wasting your time here. You speak good English, you write good English, which is not so much better than many Indians do. And I think your future lies in furthering your education, not just working for Shell. So he suggested, and I agreed, that I apply for law. Now, why we applied for law was that I had only done senior Cambridge, which was an O-level. And to go to university, one needed A-level and further. Now, even for law, to be a member of Lincoln's Inn, which I am, you had to have A-level and you had to have Latin as one of the subjects. I had neither. I was just senior Cambridge O-level and with no Latin.
Yeah.
But I applied. And somehow I was admitted. So then I went to London in, I think it was I cannot remember the year. But yes, I was called to the bar in 1959 at Lincoln's Inn, London.
Yeah.
Came back to Nairobi in 1960. And that's how my legal career here started.
And maybe just looking at that part of your early years, how would you describe what your early years were like?
Now, Kenya was divided racially in those times. So Europeans lived in their own compartments. Indians lived in their own, particularly in parklands, up to First Avenue parklands, on Nagara. They didn't cater for the African at all. As to whether he lived or where did he live. So we sort of lived in our own compartments. Europeans on Europeans, Indians all lived among ourselves. And quite honestly, I don't think I ever met a European during my school days, many years after.
Yeah, okay. So we're here partly because of your book, which I would say is one of the best ways of history documented through somebody's eyes, from Jomo to Uhuru. But before we get into that, maybe let me ask you this question, is how I begin most of the time. What's on your shelf?
What's on my shelf?
Yes.
Let me confess to start with that I have a problem with my eye. I damaged my eye very early on, my left eye. So I have problem reading. But so my reading that way is to its minimum. But my stress when I start reading is mostly on biographies. As you can see here, I have Mandela, I have Gandhi, I have Nehru, Jinnah. These are the kind of biographies that I normally read. Not very much fond of novels as such.
Yeah.
Biographies or historical
Yeah.
books.
So maybe just a quick, these are some of the books we've picked from Mr. Rao's shelf. And I would not say these are his top 5 picks because this was a bit random. But now, out of the shelf, we picked these 5. I would call them the lucky 5. So maybe through them quickly, maybe through one by one. Tell us something about this book, India Partition, Independent.
Is this the book on Jinnah?
Yes.
Yeah. This is an interesting book on Jinnah, written by Jaswant Singh, who was the foreign minister of India. And it interested me particularly because Jinnah was really the prime mover of the partition of India between India and Pakistan. Jinnah was a very staunch leader, freedom fighter in the Indian freedom movement. And at that time, he sort of fought alongside Gandhi, alongside Nehru. But then I think he had ambitions of his own. And then there was a sort of a clash between him and Nehru, both of equal intellectual standard and equal popularity. That's when I think he looked to separate from India so that he could have a state where he could be the head. And that's how he developed this idea of asking for Pakistan, a separate state for the Muslims.
But what would you say was the most outstanding part of this book for you?
Well, I wanted to read about Jinnah because Jinnah, in many ways, he moved from one end to the other. Jinnah was very active in the Indian freedom struggle, worked, as I said, with Gandhi, with Nehru, etc. But I think in the end, he was very sort of ambitious and he wanted himself to be the leader. Now we found that in India, he couldn't get a place because he was competing with people like Gandhi, people like Nehru. So he had this idea, I think he was the instrument behind the partition of India into India and Pakistan. Because in Pakistan, he became the head of state of Pakistan.
Yeah.
Which is also rather interesting because if you know, among the Muslims, they have the Shia and the Sunnis. There's a strong division between the two.
Yeah.
And Pakistan today, most Muslims are Sunnis, not Shias. Shias is the group of the Aga Khan, the Bohras. Those are the Shias, right?
Yeah.
This is a stronger Sunni branch. And strangely enough, Jinnah was a Shia. He was not a Sunni. He was actually not a follower of the Aga Khan, but he was of that sect, of the Aga Khan sect, Ismaili, as such.
Interesting. I haven't read about him, but I think I'll make a point to look through that. Nelson Mandela.
Yeah. I think if you can compare anyone with, say, Gandhi, you could put him in that class. Because having been in prison for so many years, having suffered from the apartheid, in the apartheid movement so much, this man had no bitterness at all when he came out of jail. And he said, if I live with those memories, then I will be living still in that era.
Yeah.
You know? He says, I would like to get out of it. And that's how he sort of never looked back on his imprisonment, on the way that, how badly he was treated during the apartheid days.
Yeah. But if you think about his character as a person, what would you say sets him apart?
You set him apart because here was a man who had been imprisoned for so long. And I happened to go and see that particular cell when I was on a visit to South Africa. Small little cell where he was imprisoned for so long. Right? And yet when he comes out with really no bitterness, he's not talking of any kind of bitterness against those who had imprisoned him for, I can't remember the number of years, but I think something close to 14 years. And if you saw that little cell, you would be amazed that someone could be just put in that cell and live there for 14 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he came out of that cell and carrying absolutely no bias or prejudice or resentment
Yeah.
against those who had put him in. So he's unique in many ways. I think if you compare Gandhi, if anyone could be compared to Gandhi,
Yeah.
I think you compare Nelson Mandela.
When you look at his lifetime, when you look at the foundation he created for South Africa, he looks like he had set up South Africa for success.
Yes.
But when you look at the present day South Africa, doesn't look like it is the same setup.
No,
Mandela.
Nelson Mandela's setup was very different. Incidentally, I had the good fortune of meeting him. There was a meeting of the heads of state in Harare. And I was attending a reception by the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. And when it was sort of dissipating, word came round that Mandela had just been released in South Africa. And he was flying down and coming to that particular meeting. So we waited, and the people started gathering back because he had now come. Very interestingly, when he came, of course, he was surrounded by a crowd or by people asking him all kinds of questions. And there was an Indian girl there who came up to me and he said, "Can you introduce me to Mr. Mandela?" I said, "I don't know Mandela." So he said, no, but you will have a chance of meeting him. And when you do meet him, can you introduce me to him? So I said, fine, if I meet him, certainly will mention and introduce you to him. So when Mandela was being questioned by people asking all lots of questions, I called this girl and I said, look, ask him, what will you have to drink? She looked at me. She said, what? I said, I told you. She says, ask Mr. Mandela, what will you have to drink? So she, in a very loud voice, top of all those people who were gathered round him, said, excuse me, Mr. Mandela, what will you have to drink? And Mandela, with a very tall man, he looked down and he said, that's the first intelligent question I've been asked. So he moved out of that crowd. He came to this girl, said, thank you very much. I would very much like a drink. But tell me, what made you ask that question? So she pointed to me and she said, he's the one who put me up. So he came to me and he said, who are you? And I told him that I was so-and-so from Kenya. Then he started talking about Kenya. He started talking about Jomo Kenyatta and others.
Yeah.
So I had a very nice meeting with him. And also, interestingly, when after the meeting was over and everybody had gone, in the evening when he was sort of leaving the hotel, and people had gathered outside to have a look at him. So I was going to my hotel, and I saw people gathered. And I said, what's happening? They said, we are waiting for Mr. Mandela to come out. So I also waited with the crowd. So out comes Mandela. He walks up to his car. And then he sort of spotted me in the crowd opposite. So he did this to me. He called me. And he was on the other side, I remember, of the bonnet. He put his hand across and he said, I am Mandela. You remember, we met at the cocktail.
Wow.
So I shook hands with him. I said, of course, Mr. Mandela. It was a privilege to have met you.
Yeah.
So,
But now, out of curiosity, I'd like to know now to ask that question. What made you think about that? What was going through your mind to suggest to that lady to ask Mandela what he would have a drink? What was the idea behind that question?
the idea behind that question was, of course, to attract his attention to this lady. Because there was this crowd of people around asking him questions. And also for him to have some kind of a distraction getting away from that crowd. You see, when you're crowded round and people keep on asking you questions. So I think he welcomed that idea. He got an opportunity to get out of it, talk to that girl. And then the girl said that it was me who suggested ask him that.
Yeah.
So he came over to me and then started asking me about Kenya, about Kenyatta and others. So it was a very nice opportunity.
Do you think there is a Mandela left somewhere in Africa?
I doubt very much. I think we were very fortunate in having someone like Mandela who came close to people like Gandhi. I think today to find someone like that would be impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe through your eyes, when you look at that era of leadership, looking at Nelson Mandela, you're looking at Patrice Lumumba, looking at Sankara. These are people who had very common principles of leadership, yet maybe they never met. I've not seen anywhere documented that they might have met somewhere before. And when you're looking at that crop of leadership and the people who emerged from the African continent and the ideologies that informed their nature of leadership, yet I would assume they were going through a more difficult season of life because of the transitions with the colonial era versus the leaders that we have today.
Yes.
What is the difference? What from where you sit, where did we lose it as a continent?
Where did we lose it as a country? We had some very able people, like in Nigeria, we had the Nigerian leader, what was his name? I forget for a moment. But Nigeria had some very great leaders. Kenya, of course, we had Kenyatta, Jomo Kenyatta. We had people like Odinga, Tom Mboya.
Yeah.
I think Tom Mboya was, Kibaki was also there at that time. And before his accident, he had quite an injury to his brain.
Yeah.
And he wasn't the same Kibaki that we had known before the accident. But Kibaki also intellectually very sound, a very good speaker. If at all close to anyone, I think he was close to Tom Mboya. Now, Tom Mboya was a very self-made man. He hadn't gone to university or anything like that. More of a trade union leader who had gone to Oxford for some trade union course. But he was just natural.
Yeah.
If you could put brilliance at anyone's door, I think that was Tom Mboya. And unfortunately, we lost him through that assassination.
Yeah.
Because otherwise he would have had a great future. And Kenya would have had a great future under someone like that. I was fortunate in having known him. Not just known him, but known him. I did a number of cases for the Kenyan freedom fighters. So we had two Indian lawyers, myself and there was a I forget the name, but there were two Indian lawyers, myself and another one. So when Tom had any cases of any freedom fighters, he would come to me. Whatever little money he had, he would put on my table, and I never went for money. And he said, please defend so-and-so, defend so-and-so, defend so-and-so. So I did quite a few of those. And Odinga invariably went to the other person, right? Whether he charged him or didn't charge him, I don't know. But he did cases that Odinga took to him. But in the course of doing that, fighting for defending almost so many of those freedom fighters on a pro bono basis, I think I acquired the reputation of being a criminal lawyer. So it took me I benefited from that experience, not financially, but otherwise,
reputation
getting
wise.
to be known as a criminal lawyer.
Yeah. And I'm sure we'll talk about that extensively when we're talking about your book, because you've documented that adequately. Let me just transition to the next one. Raj.
These are, I'm more fond of not so much as I said of novels, but biographical, historical, that kind of thing, you see. And this is a very nice book by Gita Mehta on the Raj. That's the British Raj.
Tell us about this one.
Well, I think the cover itself will tell you, I suppose, what it is about. It says, doesn't really say what it was about. Born into a prominent Indian family, educated in India and at Cambridge, worked on a number of television films and published one previous book, Karma Kola, Marketing the Mystic of the East. So, and this book is basically, I would not say a novel, but a fairly biographical thing, sort of starting, say, in 1897 about India, and quite an interesting, very well written by Gita Mehta.
Sorry. Having been born in Kenya, did you always feel pressure to want to know so much about India as a state?
No, you see, being an Indian, I think you always was interested in what was happening in India. I hadn't been to India. I went for the first time to India in 1948 at the age of, must be 13, I think. That's the first time we went to India, 1 year after India became independent. But most of the time we were here, we didn't. Of course, every Indian has that kind of a attachment to what could be not directly my motherland, but say my parents' motherland.
Yeah.
So I think most Indians have that sort of affinity to India.
Yeah.
But those of us who are my age, born here, citizens of Kenya, our first and foremost loyalty is to Kenya rather than to India. And that is usually shown when you have a match, for instance, where you have a hockey match between Kenya and India.
Yes.
So as to where your loyalty lies. So those of us who are from Kenya, born here, we will be backing Kenya. And those who are not will be backing India. So on a cricket field or a hockey field or something, you can see how those loyalties.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if you're joining us right now, today we are sitting with Mr. Sharad Rao, who has had an illustrious career in, let me just say, in the justice sector, because it's wide. From being in the judiciary, he worked in the executive, served in various capacities, which we are going to unravel today, seated with him. But this is what's on your shelf. And we are happy to be seated here with you. And if at all you are joining us right now, we want to ask you to kindly subscribe to the channel if this is the very first time you're here. But also, we're happy to have partnered with the Nuria Bookstore, who is the leading online bookstore in Kenya today. And they are partners of this podcast, together with the Kenya National Library Service, who are the national library service in this Republic of Kenya. So check out their spaces. Check out Nuria at nuria.com, but also check out Kenya National Library at knls.ac.ke and see the range of services that are offered in those spaces. But today, what a privilege it is to sit here and listen to history through the eyes of a gentleman who's seen it, lived it, and now is here today with us to share it. So, Mr. Rao, as I conclude on your top 5 picks, dimensions of justice, and I've spoken about justice a lot. Your name is synonymous with justice. Tell us about this book.
This is where I gave a lecture.
Yeah.
This is a very, K.T. Desai was a very prominent judge in India.
Yeah.
And I was asked to give a talk, to be the keynote speaker when they were celebrating his whatever number of years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was privileged to do that, speaking to the Bar of India. So that's that book there. All right.
So it's your keynote, or?
No. I am what I said about him.
Yeah.
I think he's in
was
that
based
book.
on this book.
Yeah.
Oh, but maybe, how would you identify with him, having been in the same sector as he was?
somehow, well, I knew his daughter. She's called Sujata Manohar. She was me at Lincoln's Inn when we were students together. From there, when she went back to India, she became a magistrate, she became a judge. She eventually rose to become the Chief Justice of India. Right? Very able person. So I knew her from the days that we were at Lincoln's Inn together.
Yeah.
And she then invited me to speak, give the keynote lecture at 100 years or whatever it was that they were celebrating about judge. Yeah.
All right. So allow me to transition to your books. You have 2 titles. And I want to start with this one.
The Dukawalas.
The Dukawalas.
Yeah.
Tell us about the Dukawalas.
Now, if you see the Indian Dukawalas, it tells you here as to why I wrote it. I said here in my preface that Sir Edward Greek, who was a former governor, had said that the railway was the beginning of all history in Kenya.
Yeah.
And while building the railway, the Asians set up small shops, the dukas, along it, and soon afterwards in the remotest parts of Kenya. They tracked through thick jungle and bush and opened up Kenya for development. Asians, who were then referred to as Indians, can thus claim due recognition for the part they played in its building, and that too through very difficult and challenging circumstances. So that's the history of how the Indians first came here to build the railway, built the railway, then put up those little dukas along the railway line, and from the remote, and sort of went into the remotest parts of Kenya.
Yeah.
So wherever you went in those days to the most remote part of India, you would find one Indian duka. You see? So in many ways, the credit goes to them for having opened up Kenya for development.
Ah. So what parts of this book would you identify the most with, having seen, having witnessed?
Well, as I said, the book starts with how the Indians first came to Kenya.
Yeah.
Right? They came in dhows. The first lot of Indians came in, about 350 of them landed in Mombasa.
Yeah.
They were brought to build the railway. So more and more came. And I think by the time when the railway was complete, there was something like 31,000 Indians here who had worked on the railways. Most of them then left. 6,000 were left behind. And those 6,000 then went into different professions, industries, shops, etc.
Yeah.
You see, that's how the Indian population here grew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll talk about that because I want to transition to this. This is the book I have read. And I think just from you set us up from the get-go, where you're talking about your parents.
Yeah.
And how they ended up here. When you're looking at who they were, your father, looking at your mother, who was also an activist, how would you talk about your upbringing?
You see, my father was an accountant. My mother, she was a school teacher. She was the principal of a school. And she was giving private tuitions. And when he was an accountant working for some company, I don't think he was earning more than, say, 600 or 700 shillings a month. This was not sufficient for her to run a family.
Yeah.
So my mother supplemented that by working in the school and giving tuitions and things like that. So I don't come from a family which had money.
Yeah.
We came from a family where we had financial constraints. And that's how my life sort of began, with those financial constraints. So as I said, I had to leave school after senior Cambridge because we did not have the financial means for me even to go up to advanced level or to go to university. So after leaving school, when I started job on my own, working for Kenya Shell for 3 years or so, is when I was prompted by my boss, European boss. He said, you write good English, you speak good English, this is not a place for you. So you venture out, go out and study. And he's the man who suggested that I apply for law, which I did. And a few months later, I went to London And in fairly short time, about 2.5 years, I sort of qualified as a barrister and came back.
Ah.
So when I came back, I think it was 1959 that I had qualified. And then we had to do 1 year of not pupillage, but residence.
Yeah.
Now, pupillage in those days meant to have to serve articles with one of the big law firms here. Most of the firms were European, and they would not take an Indian or an African, even as a pupil.
Yeah.
They would write straight back to you and say, "I'm sorry, but we do not accept Indian or African." Also for articles. So then I had this problem of finding somewhere to do my articles. So what happened was that, I'm thinking which was the first one. There was I applied to the Attorney General's office at that time.
Yeah.
And I had a small little Fiat. I went up there and I saw a parking just outside Sharia House. Right at the bottom was written reserved for the Attorney General.
Yeah.
So I parked my car there. And I still had for the appointment was 11 o'clock with the Attorney General. So I went across for coffee, came back at 11 for the interview. When I came, I saw that my car was surrounded now by policemen and things like that. So I said, "What's wrong?" And they said, "You're parked in the Attorney General's parking
lot.
place."
Yeah.
So, well, I said I didn't see it. And they showed it to me. At the bottom, it said reserved for the Attorney General. So I said, well, I hadn't noticed it. In the meantime, a European came out of the building.
Yeah.
And immediately came out, he was almost screaming, "How dare you park in my parking space?" All right? So I said, I didn't see that it was reserved for the Attorney General. And that's why I parked there. As he kept on screaming, then I said, "Who are you anyway to scream at me like this?" So he said, "I am Griffith Jones, the Attorney General." Now, that's the man I was supposed to see at 11 o'clock.
Yes.
So I said, "Oh, I'm sorry," but I got into my car and I left and I didn't go to see him.
That is how So what happens after that now with the appointment?
No, I didn't turn up. So I didn't go for that interview. So eventually I found a lawyer called O'Byrne, an Irish lawyer who had worked as state crown counsel, as they called him those days. And then he started private practice after he had left.
Yeah.
So I approached him and I said, "Could you can I do my pupillage with you?"
Yeah.
So he said, "Well, I don't have a place, but I have a room where I have a clerk, an Indian court clerk. You can share that room with him, but you can come and do your articles there." So this was in Church House on the 6th floor, where I shared an office with an Indian court clerk called Khan. Now, O'Byrne had a criminal practice. So I used to accompany him in cases where he was one of the leading criminal lawyers at the time. So I developed that bent towards criminal law. And in 1960, then he gave me a place in his chambers. They had a QC called Clive Salter. They had the famous criminal lawyer Byron Georgiadis in that chamber. And so I was given a room there. So that's where I started my practice. And as I said, in those days, in the 60s, we had the Kenya the freedom fighting movements. So there were freedom fighters being arrested and taken to court with no money to get lawyers to defend. So they depended on lawyers who were prepared to act for them without fee or with very little fee. And in those days, the two active politicians in the freedom movement was Mboya and Odinga. Odinga's father, Jaramogi. Odinga. So Tom Mboya, whenever he had a case, he would come to me and said, can you please defend so and so? And I did it without sort of looking for financial reward or being compensated. Whenever Tom had some money, he would come, put it on the table, he said, "Here is some money for you. You do a good job, please continue."
Yeah. So
he and I were good friends. We used to meet even socially quite often.
Yeah.
We had a common friend called Hassan Ratansi of Ratansi Sports House. So we used to meet quite often. He used to even been to my house and things like that. So that was the beginning of my career there, defending. And then what happened was that we had in those days a deputy mayor who was Indian called Shanti Pandit. And Shanti Pandit was accused of corruption for giving, for land change of user or something for someone. And he went to the famous Achur Kapila, who had defended Kenyatta, one of the topmost criminal lawyer at the time. And Kapila, of course, demanded, as he always did, to be paid very highly, which he was not able to afford. But when he pleaded with him, Kapila said to him, okay, bring me a junior who would do most of the work, and I will lead him in your defense. So he said he had read my name. We had never met. He said, go and see Sharad Rao and see if you would act as my junior in the cases. So he came to me and I agreed particularly because it's a good opportunity now, a very prominent case of a deputy mayor being charged for corruption. And were defended by Kapila. So it got me an opportunity now to meet Achur Kapila, to work with him as his junior. So that's how my career developed.
Yeah. I want to go back to your childhood. And what was it like growing up as a Kenyan of Indian descent?
You see, Kenya was racially divided in those days. So the Europeans lived in their own places.
Yeah.
The Indians mainly Nagara, Parkland's First Avenue was the farthest they went to. So we lived among ourselves, all Indians. And we didn't even, I hadn't met a European until I joined Shell later. Yeah. So our life was centered around Indians only. And we had no idea of discrimination or what was going on outside.
Yeah.
Because it directly did not affect us. We were quite happy in our own ways.
The schools were within...
Schools were within walking distance from us.
Yeah.
Schools were racially divided in those days. There was only one school which was the government Indian high school. That's where I went.
Yeah.
So we just lived among ourselves.
And looking at it, how would you say that shaped your sense of identity?
Didn't shift until I went to England, qualified as a barrister, came back in 1959.
Yeah.
In 1960s when I started actual practice.
Yeah.
That's when I was hit by this idea of that Kenya was sort of racially divided.
Yeah.
There was discrimination. Even in getting articles with the law firms, you were rejected because you were an Indian.
Yeah.
They said, no, we don't take an Indian or an African.
They would tell you outright.
Outright. You get
regardless of your qualification or your level of
they
education.
They would not accept,
Yeah.
So that's how Kenya was in 1960.
Yeah.
When I sort of started off.
But now I'm looking at your peers, I'm sure at that stage around that 60 when you're admitted at the bar, you have peers you have met now, you've interacted with people from other races, but what was it like for young professionals like you who are now reeling for the next stage of life?
We still faced a lot of discrimination.
Yeah.
As I said, even when I was with this lawyer called Uhuru, who I was doing articles with, when we went to places like Athi River from here, there was an inquiry going on there between the Maasais and tribal war between the Maasais and the Kikuyus, and he was acting for the Maasais. So we used to, before a man called Sir William Lindsay, who was quite a prominent lawyer at the time. So we used to go to Athi River for that inquiry, which lasted for quite some time. But as I said, the atmosphere there at the time was still very discriminatory.
Yeah.
In Athi River, there was no place. There was only one cafe which would only serve Europeans. And there was the DC who was European. So Byrne, my boss, would go to him and they would have their lunch or whatever. I would take a little tiffin in my little car. I had a Fiat 1100.
Yeah.
Take it, park it under a tree, open my TV, have my lunch. Yeah, so that was what Kenya was in the early 60s.
Then coming down to 1970, you joined the AG's office.
Yeah, from 1960 when I started practice, and I made a name as criminal law very soon. So in 1970, 70. Yeah, by that time I joined Kapila,
Yeah.
the one who had defended Kenyatta at the time and things like that.
Mm.
Then I had a difference of opinion with Kapila.
Mm.
What had happened is that, he was known for charging very high fees.
Yeah.
And he had agreed to defend an Indian chap, Patel, who could not afford me. He agreed he could not afford his fees. So he asked me to defend. And even for that, he had charged very, very high fee.
Mm.
But on the basis that I would, not he, but I would defend him.
Yeah.
So after I defended him, and actually we had to plead guilty because there was no defense to that case. And this man went in for 7 or 8 years. The following day, his wife came with 4 or 5 little children to the chambers, accompanied by the instructing lawyer that we had called Joshi. And he said to me, this is the wife and the children of the Patel who went to jail yesterday. And they have nowhere to live. So they want to go to India. So they will go by what used to be called deck class.
Mm.
So you just stayed on the deck, open deck. No cabins or anything like that.
Mm.
That was the cheapest way to travel to India. So he said, if you can help for the children, wife and children, so that they can afford to go on this dock deck class, go to India. So I went to Kapila and I told him, I explained to him. And I said, look, we had charged him quite heavily, yet the case was over in a day because we pleaded guilty. He went in for 7 or 8 years. And now they want some money to be able to go to India, and this will be the cheapest possible way. And Kapila's answer to me was, we are not a charity. The answer is no. I was completely taken aback. Here was a woman with small children asking us for help, from where we had charged so much money for defending him.
Yeah.
And yet he had pleaded guilty, and within a day, less than a day, the case had been over. But he could not be persuaded. So I came out, and the little money which I had in my pocket, I took it out and I gave it to this lady. I said, look, the firm is not willing to help you, but here's some money I have, take it, whatever help that you can get. And that angered me. I was very frustrated with that attitude.
Mm.
So I walked out. I walked and I came to the Charter Hall where lawyers used to meet for coffee. And there I met the then DPP called John Hobbs. And he was with Karugu. Karugu was the senior state counsel at the time.
Mm.
The two of them at a table having coffee. So I said, can I join you? They said, yes. So I went and joined them. And Hobbs looked at me and said, Sharad, is something wrong? You don't look well. So then I told him about this, what had happened.
Yeah.
So he said, what do you intend to do? So I said, right now, I have no idea. I've just walked out of that office. I'm not going back there. What I will do at the moment, I said, I have no idea. He said, can we meet here tomorrow for coffee? 10:30.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So the following day, I went for coffee. I met him and Karugu. And they said, we have an offer for you. He said, Kenyatta is very keen that his position, John Hobbs, as European DPP, he wanted to be Africanized. And he said he has Karugu in mind. But John Joe feels that he doesn't have enough experience. If you would join us, even for a temporary period, that can give him that lack of experience you can make up. And Kenyatta could be persuaded to make him the DPP. So I agreed. And I said, on what basis do I come? Because there are so many state councils, senior state council there. Quite a few of them were Indian state council.
Yeah.
So I said, how do I fit in there? So I said, don't worry, we will create a position for you. So that's when they created for the first time the position of assistant DPP. And I was the first one to be appointed assistant DPP. So that's how I went into this office as assistant DPP.
As an assistant DPP. So that joining that office, and then now came the second president, Moi.
Yeah, so during Moy's time, I was doing almost all the leading cases I was prosecuting.
Yeah.
So I had quite a reputation of as a prosecutor.
Yeah. Maybe just
And
move something. Yeah.
when Moy became president, and at that time, I appointed me as the DPP when Jonjo resigned, and Karugu became the Attorney General. So at that time, Moy appointed me as the DPP.
Yeah.
That's how I.
There was also something you've documented on Njonjo's resignation. Maybe to somebody who's not read, maybe just briefly, what were the issues going on around that time that led to his resignation?
Why was Jonjo's resignation? No, Jonjo was a very powerful figure, as you know, at that time. He controlled the police, he controlled the CID, he controlled. So there was this group of people who wanted him out of that position. Too powerful a man. And whenever they had something which the president had agreed,
Yeah.
if Jonjo went there and Jonjo was not in agreement, he would have it reversed. So they wanted Jonjo out of that office, you see. So they all worked towards it. And the first thing they did was to get him to offered him a political position and said, if you resign as Attorney General, you stand for Kikuyu as an MP. We will see to it that you get through as an MP. And that's how it was organized. They got him to resign. They got him to stand as an MP for Kikuyu. He was duly elected. He became Kwina MP for Kikuyu.
Yeah.
But in doing that, he had lost all his power. He was no longer the Attorney General.
Yeah.
He didn't now command the police or the CID or the things like that. So they had now neutralized Jonjo at that time. So that's how he ended up. So when Jonjo resigned, Karugu, of course, became the Attorney General, Attorney General, and I was appointed as the DPP.
Yeah. When I'm looking at now, you're the DPP, you have a reputation as a criminal lawyer. The 1982 coup, which is a very famous part of history of this country, happens in your tenure as the DPP. What's going through your mind over that season?
Yeah, that was the 1st of August, 1982. So when we heard about the coup, heard it on the radio at about 6 or 6:30 in the morning. And I immediately took a recording. In fact, though, they didn't have a recording. It was my recording, which I gave to Jonjo, and Jonjo gave to Moy. So I recorded that thing when the coup leader said that we have overthrown the government. So at that time, of course, then I got a call from Jonjo to say that they are now looking for what they call the president's men. And they're near the mini market. They're walking towards us. So please guard yourself. Okay. So what we did in those days used to have your nameplate outside. So we called us a gardener and said, remove the nameplate.
Yeah.
And what I did, I shaved, I had a shower, and I got dressed up. So my wife said, why are you doing this? So I said, look, if they come for me, I don't want to be going in my pajamas. I'd rather go dressed up properly dressed with my blazer and all that. But it never happened. I mean, they didn't come that far. So that was the 1st of August for me in 1982. And then I think after I dressed up and all that, I rang up Mathaiga police station and asked them if they could find my driver in my car. I had a GK car in those days. So they were able to trace him. And the car came here. And during those riots and all that, I drove from here to my office. Through all that.
What's going through your mind as you're driving?
Well, first of all, I said, if everybody runs away, I rang Nachai. Nachai was the chief of civil service at the time.
Yeah.
I rang him and he said, oh, I'm hiding. I said, Mr. Chai, if you hide, if Jonjo hides, then these people will take over. You need resistance now. We have got to whatever one wing of the army, the Air Force was still with them.
Yeah.
So I said, you have to get them out.
Yeah.
Because people join the winning side. And if they see that the government is losing, they will all join the opposition.
Yeah.
So do something about it, you see. So they rang up Moy. Moy was in Nakuru at the time. He was very brave. He sort of drove from there, although it was a Air Force coup. He drove from Nakuru to Nairobi in the car, went straight to the KBC, and he made a broadcast saying that he was there, and they were now. And General Muhammad was someone who came over, and they said, we have the situation under control,
Yeah.
and there's nothing to fear. So that's how it was retrieved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Looking at the character of President Moi, how would you define who he was?
You see, Kenyatta and Moi were very different people. Yeah. When you talk in terms of ability, of course, Kenyatta was a very able. Frankly, Moi was not. But Moi had an eye on everything that was happening in Kenya. You know, he knew everything that was happening. So he was very good at it, Moi. And so when he was in charge, he knew exactly what was happening where and what steps should be taken to remain in power. So that's how he sort of consolidated himself. He took over as he was vice president, right?
Yeah.
And there was opposition to him taking over as president.
Yeah.
Because the Kikuyus wanted a Kikuyu. And Junjo said, no, you have to follow the constitution. He's the vice president, he takes over. And so he imposed Moi on them. And then when Moi came into power, he was a very powerful president. I think he knew exactly how to control the situation.
But very many people say they never saw it coming. People, like when Moi was the vice president, he didn't look like he was gonna even be the president.
Yeah. And he wouldn't have but for Jonjo. They wanted a Kikuyu as the president.
Yeah.
All right? It was Jonjo who forced them into this, saying, no, you have to follow the constitution.
Yeah.
He is the vice president, he takes over as president. So he should be very grateful to Jonjo, although he set up a commission of inquiry against him later on.
Yeah. But then when you're looking at yourself, looking at that position as the DPP,
the Indian Senior Council over there, State Council, they didn't quite like the position that I was being brought now from outside over them and to be made the DPP. So a number of them resigned. Those who had been there, expected to take over as DPP or assistant DPP or whatever.
Yeah.
So a number of them resigned. But from Africans, I had no problem. And from European, we had an accounting officer called David Coward. He was the accounting officer. He was the Registrar General and accounting officer.
Yeah.
He didn't, of course, like the idea of an Indian
taking over as the DPP.
Becoming his boss.
Yeah.
So he troubled me a lot. He troubled me right from the start when I was appointed as DPP. So first of all, when I asked for the office that I was sitting in, small office, so the DPP's office, next to the AG's office, he then had allocated it to a New Zealander who was a draftsman. And I said, but that's the DPP's office. So I said, well, now we have allocated it, So you have to wait till he finishes his assignment, goes.
Yeah.
So all those years when I had to remain in a small office, not the DPP's office. Then I said, now as DPP, I'm entitled, of course, I was entitled to a car and a driver. So I said, what about my car? And he said, you're not entitled to a car. I said, surely. The DPP always has a car, had a car. He said, no, that was personal to Karugu. I said, Mr. Kaur, there's nothing personal to Karugu. He had a car because he was the DPP. I am now the DPP.
Yeah.
And I am entitled to a car. He wouldn't agree. So I had to ring Kireni in the office of the president. So they directed him. He's entitled to a car, give him a car. So they brought an old Volvo. And said, there's your car. I said, no, I'm not accepting this. He said, this one will break down anywhere, anytime. You see, and the driver was an old fellow with, broken discs and no teeth and all that. I said, look, I'm entitled to a proper car and a police car and a police driver. So they said, no, that was personal to Karuvi. So again, I rang up the president's office and they told him, no, give him a car. So the car they brought, I said I would not accept. So I rang Kireni's officer in and said, look, what they're giving me is a broken small piece of. He said, just go to Amazon Motors, who are agents for Volvo, buy yourself a car. So I went there and I got a Volvo and I had it delivered. And of course, when it was delivered in the basement, it was parked. And the key was now given to the accounting officer.
Yeah.
And it was covered. So when I told Kawad that, they've given me the car now, it's down there. So he said, I can't find the key. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. I said, David, what's happening? He said, I'm sorry, but I can't find the key. So after about 10 days or so, I rang Amazon Motors. And I said, send somebody, break open the lock, put a new lock. So I phoned him up and I told him that this is what I've done. He said, but how would we explain this to the Auditor General? I said, we told the Auditor General we can't find the key. So we have to, break open.
Yeah.
So 10 minutes later, he rings me. He said, Sharad, I found the key. I said, okay. Then I'll call off that one. So I said, where was it? He said, it was in my drawer. I said, well, David, I knew it was in your drawer.
Yeah.
So those were the kind of problems you faced with a European who did not want to take instructions now
Yeah.
from an Indian. But the African colleagues were very nice. They were very good. So I had no problem.
Yeah. Is separation of power truly realistic?
No, it isn't. It's never been. But it's better than what it used to be.
Now you're in an administration that is looked at as a very corrupt administration. How did you safeguard your integrity and maybe navigate?
Not our office.
Yeah.
Our office was above all that.
Yeah.
We were the people who were now against any form of corruption.
Yeah.
And whenever a corruption case came up, quite often I myself, as DPP, went into court to prosecute. You don't find the later DPP. I think the Chunga did some prosecutions. But today you don't see the DPP appearing into prosecuting a case. But most of those major criminal cases, and particularly those that related to corruption, I prosecuted myself.
Yeah.
Because we took a strong view against corruption.
But
when you look at some of the decisions, some of those withdrawal of cases, it raises a question mark as to whether those were independent decisions of the DPP's office or whether they were influenced.
looking at all these presidents, looking at from the Kenyatta to Moi, Kibaki, Uhuru, and now Ruto, what would you say sums up a president?
I think among those, the one that I would put my hands on is